Yes, hello. I'd like to inquire about renting a 30-yard industrial dumpster. The voice on the other end, a gruff-sounding man named Tony, replied, Certainly, sir. For what type of project? Just general household waste, I said, trying to keep a straight face. A lot of it. There was a brief pause. A 30-yard? That's quite large for residential. Are you sure? Absolutely, I said with as much conviction as I could muster. The, volume of our refuse has increased dramatically recently. I mentally pictured Karen's pristine, perfectly manicured lawn. Yeah, dramatically. All right then, Tony said, sounding slightly skeptical. And where will this be located? It was a Saturday morning, the kind where the sun's out, the birds are chirping, probably gossiping about Karen's aggressively manicured rose bushes, if I had to hazard a guess. And all I wanted to do was perform the weekly ritual of wrestling my bins to the curb before the garbage truck's punctual arrival. Standard-sized bins, mind you. Nothing ostentatious. Nothing that screamed, "Look at my excessive waste." Just your run-of-the-mill, city-issued blue for recycling and green for everything else. They'd been serving me faithfully for years, never complaining, always ready to swallow my discarded banana peels and junk mail. I was just maneuvering the recycling bin, which had a particularly stubborn wheel, out from its usual spot behind the garage, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of Karen's power-walking sneakers pounding the pavement with the rhythmic intensity of a drum solo, followed by her equally unmistakable voice, sharp and demanding enough to cut glass. "Excuse me," she barked, her tone suggesting I'd just been caught red-handed sacrificing a gnome on my front lawn. I straightened up, forcing a semblance of pleasantness onto my face. "Morning to you too, Karen. Lovely day we're having, isn't it?" I even threw in a little sunshiny smile for good measure. She stopped dead in her tracks, her gaze locking onto my poor, defenseless trash bins, like they were harboring some highly contagious and socially unacceptable disease. These need to go. Each word was delivered with the gravitas of a Supreme Court ruling. I blinked slowly, trying to process the sheer audacity of the statement. These, my perfectly ordinary trash bins that I use once a week? Yes, your trash bins. She practically spat the words, as if the very act of uttering them left a bad taste in her mouth. They're unsightly. They're a visual pollutant. They're undoubtedly lowering the property value of this entire street. And frankly, Arthur, she leaned in conspiratorially, as if sharing a deep, dark secret, they're an affront to this neighborhood's carefully curated aesthetic. I took a moment to survey the street. Across the way, Mrs. Henderson's blue bin was overflowing, a precarious tower of cardboard held together with a single, strained bungee cord. Next door, Timmy's basketball hoop lay forlornly on its side, its orange rim nestled amongst his family's bins. And down the street, Mr. Rodriguez's collection of, well, let's just say the contents of those bins remained a mystery to us all. But they'd been stubbornly residing on his curb since last Tuesday. And my bins, the epitome of suburban normalcy, were the problem? "Karen," I said, trying to inject a note of reason into the conversation. "They're standard-issue trash bins. Everyone on the street has them. It's kind of the default setting for waste disposal in a residential area." "Well, I don't like them," she declared, crossing her arms over her chest with an air of finality. "And I expect them removed by the end of the day. Otherwise," she puffed out her chest, a maneuver that always made her look like an angry pigeon, "I'll be calling the Homeowners Association. Now, here's the comedic gold. Our street doesn't have a Homeowners Association, never has. But Karen, in her infinite wisdom and unwavering belief in the power of bureaucratic threats, seemed to think conjuring up this phantom organization would somehow make me tremble and comply. I just stared at her for a beat, a slow burn of annoyance starting to simmer in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't just the bins. It was the culmination of years of her petty grievances. The time she complained about the excessive cheerfulness of my yellow mailbox, the incident where she measured my lawn with a ruler and declared it 1/4 of an inch too long, the countless passive-aggressive comments about the disruptive tranquility of my perfectly normal wind chimes. The woman was a walking, talking, perfectly coiffed embodiment of neighborhood nuisance. "Right," I said finally, trying to sound as dismissive as possible while still maintaining a veneer of civility. "Well, have a pleasant day, Karen." I turned back to my bins, the image of her self-righteous face already starting to grate on my nerves. I wrestled the bins to the curb with more force than necessary, the injustice of it all fueling my movements. Back inside, I tried to shake off the encounter, flipping through the endless stream of weekend morning television, but the sheer ridiculousness of her demand kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. It wasn't just about the trash bins, it was about the principle of the thing. Who was she to dictate what kind of waste receptacles I could have? Later that day, seeking solace, and perhaps a bit of validation, I called my friend Mark, a man who appreciated the finer points of suburban absurdity. I recounted the morning's delightful encounter, exaggerating Karen's dramatic pronouncements for comedic effect. "So, what did the neighborhood terror want this time?" he asked, his voice already laced with amusement. Mark had had his own run-ins with Karen over the years, mostly involving the strategic placement of his garden gnomes. "My trash bins, Mark! Apparently they offend her delicate sensibilities. Said they were an affront to the neighborhood's aesthetic." I mimicked Karen's haughty tone, which made Mark chuckle. "Seriously? What did you say?" I tried to be reasonable. I pointed out that everyone has them, but it got me thinking. If she doesn't like my trash bins... I trailed off, a mischievous glint forming in my eye that Mark, despite being miles away, could probably sense through the phone line. "Oh no. Arthur, what are you planning?" Mark's tone shifted from amusement to mild concern, a familiar note in our conversations whenever my more creative problem-solving instincts kicked in. "Let's just say I'm considering an upgrade." I hung up, a wicked grin spreading across my face. The seed of an idea had been planted, watered by my simmering annoyance, and it was starting to sprout into something beautifully, wonderfully petty. That evening, fueled by a potent combination of indignation and a desire for comedic retribution, I found myself deep down the rabbit hole of online research. I started with innocuous searches like discreet trash can alternatives, but that felt far too compliant. Then I ventured into slightly more rebellious territory with phrases like ways to annoy your neighbor legally. That led me to some interesting, albeit occasionally questionable, suggestions involving strategically placed garden sprinklers and the liberal use of wind chimes. But nothing quite captured the level of satisfyingly absurd escalation I was aiming for. Finally, on a whim, I typed in industrial waste disposal. And that's when I saw it. A picture. A glorious, awe-inspiring picture of a 30-yard roll-off dumpster. The kind you see dominating construction sites, capable of swallowing entire rooms of debris. This behemoth of a dark green metal container looked like it could comfortably house a small car, with room to spare for all the neighborhood's discarded dreams and broken appliances. "Oh," I whispered to myself, a slow, deliberate smile spreading across my face. "Oh, this could work. Perfectly." I clicked through the details, my excitement growing with each line of text. Ideal for large construction projects, commercial cleanouts, and significant residential renovations. I scrolled further, my eyes scanning the specifications. Can be placed on private property or with a permit on public right-of-way. My eyes narrowed, fixated on that last phrase. Public right-of-way. The curb. The very edge of my property, bordering that sacred, invisible line that separated my little slice of suburban heaven from Karen's meticulously maintained kingdom. I imagined the scene. The massive green dumpster, a stark and unapologetic contrast to Karen's pristine white picket fence and perfectly manicured lawn. I pictured her face, the carefully constructed mask of suburban serenity crumbling into a glorious tableau of disbelief and outrage. Her perfectly coiffed hair would probably stand on end, each strand a testament to her escalating fury. Her meticulously applied makeup would likely run down her face in a salty river of disbelief and utter defeat. I chuckled, the sound echoing in my quiet living room, a sound that held the promise of sweet, sweet, comedic justice. She wanted them gone? They'll be unforgettable. The next day I was on the phone with a local dumpster rental company, trying my best to sound like a responsible homeowner embarking on a major, albeit vaguely defined, home improvement project. "Yes, hello?" I said, my voice carefully modulated to convey an air of casual authority. "I'd like to inquire about renting a 30-yard industrial dumpster." The voice on the other end, a gruff-sounding man who identified himself as Tony, replied with the weary tone of someone who had heard it all. "Certainly, sir. For what type of project?" "Just, general household waste," I said, trying to inject a sense of normalcy into the absurd request. "A lot of it." There was a brief, pregnant pause on the other end of the line. I could practically hear Tony's mental gears grinding as he tried to reconcile the image of a regular suburban house with the need for a 30-yard dumpster. "A 30-yard?" he finally asked, his voice tinged with a healthy dose of skepticism. "That's quite large for residential. Are you sure about that?" "Absolutely," I said with as much conviction as I could muster, channeling my inner contractor. The volume of our refuse has increased dramatically recently." I mentally pictured Karen's pristine, perfectly manicured lawn, devoid of even a single stray leaf. Yeah, dramatically. "All right then," Tony said, sounding like he'd decided not to question my potentially dubious claim any further. "And where will this be located?" I gave him my address, then carefully specified, drawing on my mental map of the street. "I'd like it placed right on the curb, as close as possible to the property line with my neighbor to the left. The house with the white picket fence." I could practically hear Tony's eyebrows shooting up over the phone. "You sure about that, buddy? That's pretty close." "Positive," I said firmly, picturing the glorious juxtaposition of the massive green dumpster against Karen's pristine white fence. "Can't be too careful with the placement." I then offered him a generous tip, emphasizing the importance of precise positioning, hoping to ensure the dumpster would arrive and be situated exactly as I envisioned. The next few days were filled with a strange mix of nervous anticipation and a growing sense of mischievous glee. Had I gone too far? Was this going to escalate into some kind of full-blown neighborhood feud, complete with passive-aggressive lawn ornaments and strategically placed security cameras? Then I'd remember Karen's condescending tone, her imperious demands, and the sheer audacity of her request, and any lingering doubts would vanish, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. Finally, the day arrived. I was in my living room, nervously pacing and peeking through the blinds every few minutes, when I heard the unmistakable rumble of a large truck approaching. My heart started to pound in my chest like a trapped bird. This was it. The culmination of days of planning and simmering resentment. The truck, a behemoth in its own right, slowly backed up to my curb, its engine groaning under the strain. Then, with a series of loud hydraulic hisses, groans, and metallic clangs, the industrial dumpster was slowly and deliberately lowered onto the street. It was even bigger and more imposing in person than in the pictures. A massive, dark green metal box that looked like it could comfortably swallow a small hatchback hole. And it was sitting exactly where I'd requested, a mere inch or two from the invisible yet fiercely contested line that separated my property from Karen's. It was a thing of beauty, a testament to the power of petty revenge. I watched from my window, a smug grin spreading across my face, as Karen's head cautiously popped out from behind her meticulously starched curtains. Her jaw dropped. Her eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. It was a sight to behold, a true masterpiece of passive-aggressive landscaping. The sheer absurdity of the situation was almost poetic. It wasn't long before the inevitable confrontation. I was in the kitchen, brewing a celebratory pot of coffee and mentally composing my opening lines, when I heard the familiar sound of her power-walking sneakers approaching my front door at an alarming speed, each step echoing with righteous indignation. The doorbell rang with an insistent, almost frantic buzz, as if her finger was permanently glued to the button. I took a deep breath, composed my face into an expression of innocent bewilderment that I'd been practicing in the mirror, and opened the door. Karen stood there, practically vibrating with fury. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage, her perfectly applied lipstick slightly askew. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger towards the monstrous green container dominating the curb like a misplaced alien spaceship. This utterly ridiculous monstrosity? I leaned against the doorframe, trying my best to look nonchalant. My arms crossed casually over my chest as I admired my handiwork. "Good morning, Karen. You wanted my trash bins gone." So I obliged. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the moment. "This isn't a trash bin. This is an industrial waste container. It's enormous. It's blocking my view of the street. It smells already," she exclaimed, her voice rising to a near-operatic pitch, despite the fact that the dumpster was still completely empty and therefore entirely odorless. "Well," I said calmly, taking another sip of my coffee, "it's certainly large enough to accommodate all our refuse, and I haven't put anything in it yet, so any smell is purely your imagination. Perhaps you're just smelling the sweet aroma of progress? You did this on purpose. This is harassment. You're trying to make my life miserable." Her voice was now reaching a fever pitch, attracting the attention of a few curious neighbors who were starting to emerge from their houses. "Harassment?" I raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Karen, I'm simply complying with your very specific demand. You didn't specify the size of the replacement, and frankly, I thought bigger was better when it comes to waste disposal. Efficiency, you know?" The look on her face was absolutely priceless. She sputtered, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, trying to find the words to articulate the sheer depth of her outrage. But all that came out was a series of indignant gasps and incoherent noises. Finally she huffed, turned on her heel with a dramatic flourish, and stomped back towards her house, muttering something under her breath about calling the authorities, the mayor, and possibly the United Nations. Over the next day or two, the dumpster became the undisputed star of Elm Street, a gleaming green beacon of suburban rebellion. Neighbors started to come out of their houses, drawn by the sheer audacity and comedic brilliance of the situation. Some looked bewildered, scratching their heads in confusion. Some looked genuinely concerned, wondering if I'd finally lost my mind. But the vast majority just looked thoroughly amused, a collective smirk playing on their lips as they took in the sight of the massive dumpster dominating the curb. Old Mrs. Henderson, the sweet but slightly mischievous lady with the perpetually overflowing bins and a penchant for neighborhood gossip, shuffled over with a twinkle in her eye, that could rival the brightest star. "Arthur," she cackled, leaning in conspiratorially. "I heard about Karen's request. This is pure gold. You've outdone yourself, dear boy." She gave me a hearty pat on the arm and a wink that suggested she thoroughly approved of my methods. Timmy's dad, usually a quiet and reserved fellow who mostly kept to himself, stopped by while walking his perpetually shedding golden retriever. "Arthur," he said, a wide, genuine grin splitting his face. "That's quite the statement. I have to admit, I chuckled when I saw it." He even offered to help me break it in with some of the junk he'd been meaning to take to the recycling center. Even Mr. Rodriguez, the enigmatic owner of the aforementioned perpetually full and suspiciously lumpy bins, gave me a slow, deliberate thumbs up from across the street, a gesture that I took as the highest form of neighborly approval. Of course, Karen wasn't taking this lying down. I saw her glued to her phone, pacing back and forth in her living room, presumably trying to rally support from the few neighbors who hadn't yet witnessed her initial outburst or find some obscure municipal bylaw I'd inadvertently violated. I even caught her peering out from behind her curtains multiple times a day, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated loathing every time her gaze landed on the glorious green behemoth on the curb. One afternoon I found a neatly typed letter, printed on expensive-looking stationery, tucked into my mailbox. It was from Karen, naturally, and it read, "This situation with your grossly oversized and utterly inappropriate receptacle is completely unacceptable. It is a blight on our otherwise respectable neighborhood and must be removed immediately. I have contacted the appropriate authorities and fully expect this matter to be resolved swiftly." The letter was signed with her full name, followed by a dramatic flourish of her initial. I chuckled, appreciating the sheer melodrama of it all, and tacked the letter to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a tiny, overflowing trash can, a little ironic touch that I knew would amuse Mark. A few days later, just as Karen had threatened, a city inspector actually showed up. He was a young guy, looking slightly harried, and he walked around the dumpster several times, clipboard in hand, looking thoroughly unimpressed. He finally knocked on my door, and I greeted him with my most innocent, "Who, me?" smile. "Mr. Henderson," he asked, his voice flat and devoid of any enthusiasm. "That's me," I replied, extending my hand in a gesture of neighborly welcome. He didn't shake it. "I've received a complaint about this structure on your curb." He gestured towards the dumpster with his pen, his expression suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else. "Ah, yes," I said, my tone deliberately casual. "My new high-capacity waste disposal unit. Quite the upgrade, wouldn't you say?" The inspector just stared at me for a long moment, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his eyes. "It's rather large for residential use, isn't it?" "Well," I explained, my voice dripping with faux reasonableness, "my neighbor insisted I remove my previous, smaller bins, and she didn't specify any size restrictions for the replacement. So, after careful consideration of my future waste management needs, I opted for something that would definitely meet my requirements. You know, for efficiency." The inspector sighed, rubbing his temples as if battling a sudden onset headache. "Is it blocking the sidewalk or the street in any way?" "Nope," I said cheerfully, gesturing towards the perfectly positioned dumpster. "Perfectly within the curb lines. Leaves plenty of room for pedestrians and vehicular traffic." "Is it leaking any hazardous materials or emitting any noxious odors?" "Not a drop," I assured him, crossing my heart for dramatic effect. "It's brand new, never been used, and completely empty. Smells like fresh paint, maybe?" He flipped through his notes, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Right. Well, according to the regulations, as long as it's not obstructing public access or posing a direct safety hazard." He trailed off, looking back at the massive green container with a mixture of bewilderment and what I could have sworn was a hint of grudging admiration. Just try not to fill it up too quickly, all right? We don't want to attract any unwanted attention. He gave me a weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and walked back to his truck, shaking his head as he drove away. Karen, who had been observing the entire exchange from her perfectly manicured porch, looked absolutely apoplectic. Her face was a study in suppressed rage, and I could practically see the steam coming out of her ears. Her next attempt at escalating the conflict involved a more direct approach. I came out one morning to find her pristine white SUV parked so incredibly close to the dumpster that I could barely squeeze between the two to reach my own car. It was a blatant attempt to obstruct access to my high-capacity waste disposal unit. I simply shrugged, grabbed a small notebook and a pen, and left a polite yet subtly sarcastic note tucked under her windshield wiper. Dear Karen, while I wholeheartedly appreciate your creative interpretation of street parking and your dedication to highlighting the presence of the receptacle, access to said receptacle is occasionally required for proper waste disposal. Thank you for your anticipated cooperation in this matter. Sincerely, your neighbor. The next day, her car was back in its usual spot in her driveway, looking slightly sheepish. Then came the neighborhood meeting, ostensibly about the upcoming street fair, but everyone knew the real topic of conversation lurking beneath the surface. It wasn't officially about the dumpster, but you could feel the palpable tension in the air as everyone gathered in Mrs. Henderson's cozy living room, the aroma of freshly baked cookies doing little to mask the underlying drama. Karen, of course, brought up the elephant-sized green metal object on the curb almost immediately. This situation with Arthur's industrial bin has gone on long enough, she declared, her voice tight with indignation, her gaze sweeping across the room, daring anyone to disagree. Honestly, Karen, Mr. Peterson from across the street chimed in, a slight smirk playing on his lips. I think it's kind of hilarious. You asked him to remove his bins, and he certainly delivered on that request. A ripple of suppressed laughter went through the assembled neighbors. Hilarious? Karen shrieked, her voice rising in pitch. It's an eyesore. It's bringing down the tone of the entire street. My azaleas are probably traumatized. Well, I haven't seen any tumbleweeds rolling down Elm Street lately, I quipped, earning a few more hearty laughs and a collective sigh from Karen. He's doing this to spite me. This is a deliberate act of neighborly aggression, Karen insisted, her voice trembling with righteous fury. Karen, I said calmly, maintaining a tone of reasonable exasperation. I was simply responding to your very specific request. You wanted my bins gone. They are gone, replaced by something more substantial. Perhaps you could view it as a bold statement about the importance of efficient waste management in the 21st century. The meeting devolved into a chaotic, yet surprisingly entertaining mix of earnest arguments from Karen, sarcastic remarks from the other neighbors, and my own carefully crafted pronouncements on the philosophical implications of oversized waste receptacles. It was clear that the majority of the neighborhood, while perhaps initially taken aback by the sheer scale of the dumpster, was now firmly in the amused by Karen's predicament camp. After the meeting, Mrs. Henderson approached me, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Arthur, she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially, I have an idea. You know that ridiculously oversized garden gnome Karen's so incredibly proud of? The one with the pointy hat and the creepy smile? I nodded, a slow smile starting to form on my face as I anticipated where this was going. Over the next few weeks, the dumpster became a sort of unofficial neighborhood landmark. Kids would point at it with wide-eyed wonder as they walked by with their parents. People would stop to take pictures with it, turning it into an unlikely roadside attraction. And every now and then, a rogue piece of trash would mysteriously appear inside its cavernous depths. A stray cardboard box, an old, deflated basketball, even a slightly worse-for-wear inflatable flamingo. I always made sure to keep it relatively empty, just to maximize Karen's visual displeasure and to subtly underscore the sheer absurdity of its presence. One particularly windy day, fate, in its infinite wisdom and comedic timing, intervened in the most glorious way imaginable. A strong gust of wind swept through Elm Street, picking up a large pile of overflowing yard waste from Karen's own, much smaller and clearly inadequate, bins, and depositing it in a swirling vortex of leaves and twigs directly into my empty, cavernous dumpster. I watched the entire scene unfold from my living room window, trying my absolute best to stifle a laugh that threatened to erupt from my chest. A few moments later, Karen emerged from her house, surveyed the scene with an expression of utter disbelief, and let out a frustrated shriek that could probably be heard 3 streets over, a sound that I mentally recorded and saved for future moments of quiet amusement. Eventually, even Karen seemed to run out of steam. The formal complaints to the city ceased. The accusatory glares became less frequent and less intense. Her power walks, once a daily ritual past my house, mysteriously started taking her in the opposite direction. Perhaps she finally realized the futility of her fight, the sheer absurdity of her initial demand having backfired spectacularly, leaving her to live next to a giant green monument to her own sense of entitlement. The dumpster remained on my curb for a few more weeks, a constant, silent, and undeniably hilarious reminder of the great trash bin war of Elm Street. Then, one sunny morning, feeling like the point had been sufficiently made and the comedic timing had reached its peak, I called Tony from the rental company and asked him to come and retrieve the behemoth. As the truck rumbled away, taking the massive green container with it, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction, a sense of closure, and a perhaps slightly unsettling pang of boredom. Life on Elm Street suddenly seemed a little less vibrant. Later that day, Mark called, his voice full of amusement. "So, the reign of the Green Giant is finally over, huh?" "Yep," I said, looking out at my now empty curb, which suddenly seemed strangely bare. It was a good run, a truly magnificent run. "Did Karen say anything?" "Not a single word," I said. "But I did see her watering her prize-winning petunias this morning. She gave my perfectly normal, standard-sized trash bins a very wide berth." "Mission accomplished, then," Mark chuckled, the sound echoing with shared amusement. "I suppose so," I said, a slow, satisfied smile creeping across my face. "Sometimes, Mark, you just have to go big or go home. Or, in this case, go industrial." And that, my friends, is the definitive, fully expanded, and hopefully now closer to 5,000 words, tale of how Karen demanded I remove my trash bins, so I installed an industrial dumpster on her curb. It might not have solved all the world's problems, but it certainly brought a healthy dose of comedic chaos and a whole lot of neighborhood amusement to our little corner of suburbia. And every time I take out my regular trash bins now, I can't help but smile, remembering the look on Karen's face when that big green monster arrived, a silent testament to the fact that some battles you just have to win with a 30-yard roll-off.